Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, Energy Resilience in the Age of Climate Change. I'm Heather Clancy, Editorial Director at greenbiz.com, moderating the session today from my GreenBiz satellite office in New Jersey. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. The screen you're looking at has a number of features I'd like to point out. If you have questions for today's speakers, simply type your message into the Q&A window on the left-hand side of your screen, and we'll be fielding those later on in this program. You can download the slides from today's webcast by going to the box marked Resources on the bottom right of your screen. And finally, there's a live tweet stream in the upper right. Feel free to share what you're hearing on Twitter with the hashtag #GRNBZ. That's again, hashtag GRNBZ. Before we get into today's topic, I'd like to remind you that the Verge Conference and Expo is returning to Oakland, California from October 22nd to October 24th. Within Verge 19, there is a dedicated Verge Energy program, and there will be deep dives on 4 separate topics: climate resilience, building decarbonization, scaling renewables, and digital infrastructure. As a webcast participant, you can get a 20% discount off any type. That's if you're here live with us. Just use the code V19SW. That's V19SW. You might also want to check out the agenda for the Grid Resilience Summit taking place at Verge 19. This half-day invitation-only working session is being organized in collaboration with the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. The aim is to foster the collaboration needed to transform the grid to meet climate, energy, and grid resilience goals in the state of California and beyond. With that, let's dive into today's topic, energy resilience in the age of climate change. Extreme weather and wildfires are impacting energy infrastructure across the country and the world. Technologies such as behind-the-meter energy storage and intelligent software are emerging to help companies and communities anticipate outages and keep the power flowing. Today, we'll delve into how these technologies and collaborations between cities and companies are the right ways to approach the issue of energy resilience in today's climate. I'm excited about the speakers joining us. We have a great lineup, including Denny McGinn, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy Installations and Environment, Steve Nealand, the Director of Energy for Faith Technologies, and Emily Goldfield, Senior Associate with the Rocky Mountain Institute. With that, I'd like to get today's conversation started with contemplating what resilience means in the first place. So I went to my favorite dictionary and got sort of this general definition. Of course, it's the ability to recover quickly, to spring back, to be elastic. But what does this mean in the context of energy? To get us thinking in the right ways, Denny, I'd love to have you address that question. What does energy resilience mean anyway?
Thank you, Heather. We've all experienced over the past few years in particular energy outages, electricity outages, gas shortages, et cetera, as a result of climate change-induced natural events. The most recent Hurricane Dorian, devastating hurricane, especially in the Bahamas, coming up the eastern seaboard, and there are various spots along the way where literally hundreds of thousands of people were without power for varying amounts of time, hours into days. So the idea of resilience is that we recognize that storms are going to be more frequent, that they're going to be more intense, widespread over larger areas, and it's going to threaten our ability to carry out our economic activity, maintain our quality of life that is brought to us by electricity, for example. And so we need to think about how we can make our energy system tougher so that in the inevitable challenges ahead caused by all of the manifestations of climate change, whether it's wildfires in the west, hurricanes on the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf, or flooding throughout the Midwest, we just need to give a lot of thought in terms of technology, policy, and finance to our energy system.
So conceptually speaking, that's a great setup. You were involved in practical implementations of this in your role with the Navy, and I'm wondering if you can give us some examples. I went out and found some on my own, but I'd love to hear about some of the things that projects you were involved with and why they were considered resilient.
Well, it primarily was focused on the mission. For all of the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, it's all about the mission and how do we maintain our installations where we park our ships, our airplanes, our combat vehicles, our logistics. How do we maintain the mission effectiveness and mission resiliency by making sure that they have sufficient power, even in the face of challenges from Mother Nature? So on the screen, you can see from Alabama, the Army Redstone Arsenal, they put down distributed energy in the form of a 10-megawatt solar voltaic farm and a megawatt of energy storage, which extended out the solar day somewhat. It was financed by a private partnership agreement, public-private partnership agreement, and you can see that it has enough power to run 2,500 homes. The goal clearly was to be able to, and this is a step in the right direction, is to, for all of our bases, operate a minimum of 14 days in the event of a major energy supply disruption, whether that's caused by Mother Nature or by cyber hacking or energy or any type of traditional warfare. This other example comes from the Navy submarine base in New London, Connecticut. In partnership with the city of Groton, which is adjacent to the New London base, the Navy put in a 7.4 megawatt fuel cell park. It is a combination of some solar, natural gas storage, and a microgrid, importantly, that includes not just the critical functions of the base, the submarine base, but also critical functions in the surrounding towns. Partnered with Groton Utilities and the Connecticut Municipal Electric Energy Cooperative, it is all about energy security for the base as well as for the surrounding community. Once again, this was financed by a third-party public-private agreement. This other example comes from a National Guard base at Otis near Cape Cod in Massachusetts. 7.4 megawatt fuel cell park, and this was a partnership as well with Connecticut and Groton Utilities, and basically provides energy security for the base and surrounding community. In all of these cases, it isn't the 100% solution. These are first steps towards, shall I say, a grid of microgrids, or where you have the ability to have backup power available for extended periods of time in the face of a large system outage caused by Mother Nature or some other reason. On the
I think
screen,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you talk about Arizona first. So I want to ask you a follow-up too, but you go ahead and talk about Arizona.
This is one about Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma, Arizona. In partnership with APS, the local utility, we agreed to put a 25-megawatt generator, peaker plant, on the base, inside the fence line. And the idea was it would help all of the customers for APS in that service territory from brownouts or blackouts. If you needed it on hot days, high demand days, you could light it off. If for some reason the original base load generation failed, or there was transmission or distribution problem, you could activate this 25 megawatt peaker plant. Also, the Marine Corps on the base had it wired up so that in the event of a widespread outage, they would be able to take as much of that 25 megawatt power as they needed. it would never be quite that. It would probably never be above 5 or 7 megawatts. But the idea was it was a win-win. It was a win for APS. It was a win for all of their customers in this area that were going to have much more resilience in terms of prevention of brownouts or blackouts. And it was a win for the Marine Corps being able to have backup power in the event of a widespread power outage. So go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, so the follow-up question, you just queued it really well. First of all, I was noticing that, these are all over the place. In Alabama, Arizona, some are remote, some are in Connecticut. It's pretty, rural, it's not rural, it's pretty urban, pretty suburban. But does it matter? I mean, what effect or what effect does the location have on this sort of strategy?
I would say primarily it goes to what kinds of local or distributed energy resources are available. Mm-hmm. Some areas there's great access to natural gas, for example. Others, fantastic solar or wind power. And I would make the point that one size does not fit all. You need to take a look at how the grid, transmission grid and distribution grid is laid out. Where the load centers are, major load centers, what resources you have for energy, what kind of partnership can you get with the Public Utility Commission or the Public Service Commission and the local power providers or utilities. So it varies, but you make a key point that a solution for increasing energy resiliency in the face of climate change varies, and there are many, many options. We've seen this over the past 5 years, especially lots and lots of tornadoes or reasons for outages across the country. And people, individual families or communities are starting to invest in resilience. It could be a Honda generator that can power essential services for a home to keep refrigerated goods or water pumping or perhaps even air conditioning. But at the community and up scale, it's absolutely critical to think through how can we start putting in place the building blocks for more energy resilience. It's going to be distributed energy resources, in particular renewable energy, increased amount of storage so that you can extend and deal with extend the solar day or deal with intermittency of wind. But these are all building blocks, and most importantly, in creating a microgrid, the ability to select best value, least cost source of energy, whether it's local or off the grid, and importantly, to control your load, to make sure that you can turn off or turn on various load centers to maintain critical mission effectiveness.
So you've just addressed my next question already, which is what were some of the technologies involved, because I did notice, of course, there's fuel cells, there's solar, there's storage, and so forth. Again, you also mentioned that these involve communities as well as the military. So how can an investment in energy resilience by one organization, like a military agency or company, of course, like a big company that may be headquartered in a particular city, how can it benefit the local utility or others in the nearby community? So what benefits do you see?
I think looking for the win-win proposition. When we did a lot of our work for Navy and Marine Corps installations across the country when I was the Assistant Secretary, we looked for community partnerships. Groton is a good example. Yuma in Arizona is another one. So, but in the private sector, if I have a major industrial complex and I want to make sure that I've got assured power all of the time, despite what's going on with the weather or Mother Nature, then looking for ways to provide the power to first responders or critical community functions. One of the things we realized as we progressed down the path towards the microgrid in New London, in Groton, all of our sailors don't live on base and aren't there all the time. Their families don't. So being able to provide critical functions in the community benefits the mission almost directly. So I would say as we look for more and more resilience, partnerships are absolutely key. And where you can expand a project to increase the amount of capacity, if you will, and provide benefit to other partners, it really creates these win-win opportunities.
I'd love to invite Emily and Steve to add any thoughts they'd like. Emily, do you have anything you'd like to add? Or I know you're going to get into this more detail later.
Yeah, I think Denny really hit the nail on the head there, and what he talked about was very much the core of the energy resilience project we worked on here in the Roaring Fork Valley, which was looking at options for sharing individual resources to then benefit the entire community in the case of an emergency. And I'll definitely talk about some of these examples a little bit more during my presentation later, but we found, like Jenny said, if we can support one organization that provides critical functions to the rest of the community in investing in energy resilience, then that really benefits the entire community. And one example we saw here during the fires last summer is that if we could install backup generation on some of the local schools, it would help that facility to be a more effective evacuation center for people who are getting evacuated from their homes. So there's lots of examples we saw of this during our work, and I think Jenny really covered that well.
Steve?
Yeah, I would reiterate what Denny said also. Again, you need to look at a holistic approach, looking at the best combination of energy sources, storage solutions for the site or for the community. And the other key part of that, too, is working with the local resources, working with the local utility community, too, to ensure you have not just the proper solution, but also making sure you have the ability, in the case of needing that, in the case of a disaster, to be able to continue to provide critical resources, powering hospitals, schools, police, fire, clinics, gas stations, grocery, to keep those basic services performing for the community.
Thanks so much for that. Denny, one more question for you, actually a combo question before we move to the other speakers. Where does the money come from? You mentioned a couple of power purchase agreements. Tell me about the third-party financing. How does that work when the primary goal of an investment is energy resilience?
Well, it works in several ways, and the slide that's up there, it's a little busy, but there are three basic models where you are putting in power generation off-base for on-base consumption. Model 2 would be on-base generation for off-base consumption. That would be an example of the Yuma peaker plant. And Model 3 would be on-base generation for on-base consumption. That would be pretty much an island, if you will, of a naval installation. I would say the first two models are more frequent. And the money comes from third-party financing, power purchase agreement, where a financial entity funds the project that creates value for the Navy, creates value for the Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, and creates value for the provider, if you will, or the power provider or utility, and that is paid back over time. We did a lot of analysis of what the money flow, what the return on investment would be. It varies depending on the type of project, the scope, who's going to benefit from it, what the offsets are to existing utility bills, for example. But there is, I'll make the point, there is a lot of money that is out there looking for places to invest in energy resilience, and also to do it in a sustainable way. You hear a lot about so-called ESG investment. That is an investment that produces a benefit for the environment, a benefit for society, and also that is providing great examples of governance, whether that's board governance or governance of partnerships.
Super. Thank you so much. I am going to hold my last question originally for you to ask everyone at the end as a great wrap-up. But thank you for your setup and your perspective on this topic. It's a great introduction. And to take us to the next level, I would love to call on Steve Nealand. He's going to talk about the energy resilience characteristics of a microgrid project at the Gordon Bowles Nature Preserve in Wisconsin. Steve is with Faith Technologies, as I mentioned before. Steve, go ahead and take us to the next step.
Well, thank you, Heather. To talk about our microgrid that we have here and the other solutions we provide, the first thing I guess I want to touch on is the why. I mean, from the standpoint of the nature preserve, the why starts around their mission. Their mission is to teach the public about renewables, to teach them about sustainability. And we looked at how could we partner and continue to provide over time the ability to support that mission. And we looked at the microgrid that we've installed at Cobalt as the way to do that. So we provide all of their site energy needs through our microgrid. The other part of that is also being able to show that to the community. So how can we make a microgrid real? How can we demonstrate to this in the community in a way that they can see what the technology can do? So we have the ability with our microgrid there to open this up to the public. So we can get the public in. We can do education with students. We can do education with groups. We're also able to bring the public in with open office hours on Friday, basically at the microgrid, so we can tell them about those energy sources and about how we can build more resiliency into our distribution systems. The other part of this, too, is being able to have many purposes in one. So not only are we able to demonstrate improving efficiency by more localized generation, being able to show resiliency with the ability to have a more localized source, and sustainability, but we're also able to demonstrate the different combinations of energy resources we could have within one of these solutions. So one of the important distinctions that we always look at is helping people understand that a microgrid is it's a set of energy sources, storage, and the loads, which can operate off the grid. It can operate as an independent grid in and of itself. People often confuse this with having energy resourcing. So if I just put solar on my house, if I don't have the right type of technology to support that solar, it augments what I'm getting from my utility, but it doesn't necessarily improve my resiliency because I'm not able to operate without the utility being there. We're talking about both systems, but more importantly, from a resiliency standpoint, we want a microgrid. We want a system that can act independent from the utility. So what we've done at the Nature Preserve is we have a microgrid which has roughly about slightly under half a megawatt of generation capability. So we have an inclusion of a 65 kilowatt microturbine, which you can kind of think of as a jet engine, it's a jet turbine, that produces combined heat and power. So we're able to improve our efficiency by utilizing the heat from this system to also heat the 18,000-foot environmental center. In addition to producing the electric needs for the center, we have the ability to produce hydrogen for our fuel cell system. So we have an electrolyzer to generate hydrogen, we have a storage tank, and then we have 25 kilowatts of fuel cells that we can use to generate electricity from that stored hydrogen. To get that stored hydrogen, we have a 200 kW solar field, so we can run the site off our solar. We can also use that to generate the hydrogen, or we can also use that to charge our 100 kilowatt battery system. In addition, we also have a 60 kilowatt natural gas generator, so we're also able to utilize that if needed for power itself. And it's not simple, right? Because we've got all these systems. We have 7 major systems, lots of minor subsystems, and we have the building itself. And what we've done is we've integrated all of these systems together from one control standpoint. So again, it's not just having standalone power, but it's how, as Denny mentioned before, you have to control the loads, and how do you manage loads, and how do you integrate that in with the grid itself that you're establishing. So we have our connected devices in a base layer, which includes the facilities themselves, not just generation or storage capabilities. We have edge control, which takes care of our in-the-minute control. And as Denny mentioned earlier too, we want to optimize. So we want to be able to run the microgrid in the best manner possible. Now that could be, from a standpoint, we could look at best resiliency. So how do I make sure that I don't lose power to the site? And we'll talk about a couple instances in a few minutes on how we did that, how it actually performed. How can I lower my carbon footprint or minimize my carbon footprint or minimize my cost or combinations of those? So I have the ability from some of those higher level controls to make recommendations to my local control on how to actually operate the individual components of my microgrid. So normally in operation, we have all of our energy resources available and we're optimizing those for best application. But as I mentioned, we also created this as an educational tool, not just for the public, but for our customers too, so they can understand the different combinations of energy resources. So we also have the ability and the flexibility within our microgrid here at the Nature Center to basically turn off other resources and demonstrate different combinations, such as what if I just had solar and a natural gas generator, or solar and a fuel cell, or solar and a battery? Or what if I had a microturbine and a generator in solar? So we're able to demonstrate these in different combinations and show how those particular solutions can operate, which is one of the reasons we have so much complexity from an energy resource standpoint built into this grid. We also take a different approach. When we put this microgrid together, we had a very modular construction. We built it with connectivity for nets. So we didn't want this to be a snapshot in time, but we wanted to be continually evolved. It serves as a working laboratory for us also, where we can try new technologies. So new storage technologies, new generation technologies, new technologies for controlling our grid and for further optimizing. So again, it fits the mission of the Nature Center, and it also protects us in the future because again, we have the ability to run carbon neutral or zero carbon if we so desire. So how does this work in the real world? Well, we've had a couple of good instances which have shown us how resilient our grid is. The first one occurred roughly about a year ago on September 17th. We had the International Association of Electrical Inspectors had a dinner at the facility. We were giving tours of the microgrid, and we had a severe thunderstorm come through. The lights blinked, power stayed on, and we did not find out until later that we actually were running offline until we started looking at our data and going, oh, yeah, we had a bumpless transfer. So we operated for roughly about 5 hours that night off-grid. While the surrounding, I don't think, 4,000 or 5,000 customers were without power that night. More interestingly enough, this year, some of you may have heard about the storms that blew through Wisconsin in mid-July. We had 16 tornadoes within a 48-hour period. And electric utilities in the area had almost 300,000 customers were affected. So they had power knocked out to 300,000 people. There were 2 weddings actually scheduled at the Nature Center that day. And both of them went off without a hitch because we continued to provide power. So the utility lost power at about 5 minutes to noon on a Saturday. So the lights blinked once within the lodge. Actually, the staff who was working there thought that they just had a lightning strike someplace. The utility blinked. Actually, that was the transition into island mode, where our grid was operating off-grid. We continued to operate off-grid from that 5 minutes to 12 on Saturday till slightly before midnight on Wednesday night, without a hitch. So we were able to keep power running and keep the Nature Center up and functional. So again, this is a really good demonstration about how this technology can work in the real world and how it does provide that resiliency that we're looking for within the real world.
So I'm sure those brides were really happy with you that day. So I have a couple questions, Steve. First of all, sure. You mentioned that this is a work in progress, right? So this is evolving. Given that, I would still like to know how long it took to put this together in the first place. You know, is this an installation that took a month, 6 months? You know, how long did this take to piece together?
So it's interesting. So from concept through construction, which included site prep, building the new 18,000 square foot lodge, installing the microgrid, and bringing it up and online, was just a little bit under 12 months.
And then just what skills, you know, so obviously you do, your organization is a systems integrator, you do this, but what sort of skills would an organization need to have to pull one of these off? So, you know, there's a number of things you need to be able to do. You know, we're fortunate, as you mentioned, we're an integrator, we have a broad offering, so we have the ability to basically act as a mini GC, a mini general contractor, if you will. So we can handle all the site prep work. We're able to handle all the electrical work from the higher voltage side. We're able to install all the devices and be able to do that integration. So really, you've got a controls piece involved. You've got some power and power distribution involved. You've got the interconnection, again, back to utility and that electrical infrastructure. Depending on the particular site, this site we were fortunate everything was low voltage. It was 480 volts or lower. But quite often as we look at larger installations, as we approach a megawatt and larger, we have to look at medium voltage. So you need to be able to handle that type of thing too, where you're able to handle higher voltage for that utility interconnect. And again, the physical constraints, so the physical installation of the equipment and things you would need from a mechanical or general contractor. If you're looking at, again, augmenting this on an existing structure, let's say a warehouse, for instance, you know, you need civil engineering because you'd have to look at the ability for the building to support the loads of the equipment that would be mounted on it. So there's a number of cross-disciplines that are required for something of this complexity. Great. One more very quick question for you before we move on to Emily. Someone wants to know how long the Nature Center can operate as an island.
Well, if we have reasonable periods of sunlight, we can operate indefinitely. So we have the ability to, if you look at the typical site load, we have the ability to run for almost 24 hours off our battery storage system. We also have roughly about 24 hours worth of storage in our hydrogen tank at normal loads. So even if we did not have natural gas, with natural gas we can run pretty much until the gas supply runs out. Without natural gas, as long as we have reasonable sunlight within a 72-hour period, we can continue to run indefinitely.
Thank you so much. Great. Emily, you are up. I would love to hear you discuss the Roaring Fork Valley Energy Resilience Project on behalf of Rocky Mountain Institute. Take it away.
Definitely. Thank you, Heather. And thanks, Jenny and Steve, for sharing a bit about your work. It's really exciting to hear about other developments going on in this space. So I'll be sharing about an energy resilience project I worked on here in the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado that was largely focused on stakeholder engagement and a process of bringing the community together to identify collaborative solutions. So before jumping in, for those of you who are not familiar with RMI, we are a nonprofit think tank focused on transforming global energy use to make a more clean, prosperous, and low-carbon energy future. And we work with a pretty diverse set of partners around the world on a really wide range of projects within the energy space. And one thing that we found throughout our work around the globe is that this topic of energy resilience is really top of mind for a lot of people right now, as you've already been hearing today. And as Denny mentioned, there are a few key trends that we really see driving this focus on energy resilience. The first is an increased reliance on electricity for mobility, heat, and other services. The second is an increased risk to power supply, partly due to climate change, as well as potential for malicious attacks like cyber attacks. And then finally, this rapid decline in the cost of renewables, battery storage, and distributed energy resources is really opening up a wider range of options for providing resilience. So as we're increasingly relying on electricity to support our daily lives and critical functions, and simultaneously the threat of events that could disrupt power supply are increasing, people around the world are understandably increasingly aware of the need for more resilient power. So in addition to our work here in Colorado, which I'll talk about in just a moment, RMI has supported or is currently supporting energy resilience work in California, New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, Texas, and a little bit with the U.S. Department of Defense. And from this work collectively, we're seeing a few common questions emerge. One, how do we quantify the value of energy resilience? So how can we take into account the value of resilience when choosing between potential investments? Two, what is the right balance of investment in transmission versus DERs? Three, how can we incentivize resilience from the bottom up? And four, relatedly, what are the roles of utilities, regulators, and consumers in energy resilience? And finally, how can we encourage alignment of investments in both resilience and decarbonization? And these are all themes that came up in our work here in the Roaring Fork Valley. So for context, the Roaring Fork Valley is a fairly remote area in western Colorado. RMI has an office here in Basalt, which is about 20 minutes down valley from Aspen. And a little over a year ago, on the evening of July 3rd, a wildfire broke out just a few blocks from our office. In this fire, the Lake Christine fire, eventually spread to engulf more than 12,000 acres and took until December to be fully extinguished. And it came within minutes of shutting down power to the upper Roaring Fork Valley, because 3 out of the 4 transmission lines running into Aspen went down, and had that 4th line gone down, it could have been days to weeks before power was restored. So this event really served as a bit of a wake-up call to stakeholders across the valley of the importance of resilience planning, and was the impetus of our resilience project here in the valley. So motivated by the fire, Holy Cross Energy, which is the local electric cooperative here in the Roaring Fork Valley, reached out to RMI to partner around exploring community-based solutions for improving resilience. And the objectives of our work together were threefold. One, to identify ongoing protection and resilience efforts in the valley. Two, to surface opportunities for improving resilience of electricity and related services. And three, to prioritize solutions and near-term actions for Holy Cross and community partners. The core of the project was around stakeholder engagement and really bringing the community together to have important conversations around energy resilience. And the project involved first a series of interviews with stakeholders in the valley and background research to better understand what is already being done around the world to improve resilience, followed by a first workshop which brought together these stakeholders to surface high priority solutions, several of which were then further explored by working groups, and culminating in a second and final workshop where the working groups presented their progress and solicited support from the community to keep these projects moving forward. And we're now in the process of wrapping up our final report, which will be released soon. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on each step of the process and share with you some of our key takeaways throughout. So first, we really engaged with a pretty wide range of stakeholders throughout this process. We interviewed 30 different organizations before workshop 1, and we had between 30 and 40 people attend each of the 2 workshops. And these folks represented government, health and emergency services, transportation agencies, private businesses, school districts, utilities, and community groups. So a pretty broad range of community functions were represented. In the lead up to the first workshop, we spoke specifically with stakeholders who represent vulnerable populations or provide critical services to understand their energy use priorities and any backup plans they already have in place. And we found that there are already many regional resilience and emergency preparedness activities ongoing at different levels of government and community organization, though there are varying levels as to how well energy is taken into account in these existing plans. And we also found that most critical services have backup power that's supplied by either natural gas or diesel generators. And so this chart here shows aggregated self-reported critical loads and on-site generation of the stakeholder categories that we interviewed, with a rough estimate of how well their critical loads are backed up. Then in parallel to these stakeholder interviews, our research team explored options for resilient solutions and compiled case studies of resilient solutions around the country. And they found that even though backup generators are often the most common backup source, like you've heard already today, distributed energy resources can also provide resilient benefits in addition to benefits year-round. And like I mentioned, there are already a number of trends that are enabling DRs to be considered more widely as a resilience option. First is that these technologies are getting better and becoming cheaper, which is making them more accessible to a broader consumer base. And secondly, we're starting to see a trend toward utilities, states, and cities thinking about resilience goals in the context of their clean energy and carbon goals, which is pushing them to consider renewables and storage instead of just defaulting to fossil fuel backup generators. So together, these trends are pushing the resilience discussion beyond diesel and natural gas generators to how can we be incorporating more renewables and storage. We then hosted our first workshop at the beginning of April of this year, which brought together many of the stakeholders we interviewed to then surface potential solutions that are of interest to folks in this valley. And so during this workshop, we discussed these various resilient solutions that are being implemented around the country and around the world, from your basic backup generators to various DERs and microgrids, and the trade-offs and benefits of each. And it became clear very quickly that our community is interested in exploring solutions that provide year-round benefit as well as longer-term environmental benefits, rather than focusing solely on quick fixes. So for example, looking at solutions like solar plus storage that can provide backup power when it's needed, but also provide value the rest of the year, rather than something like a diesel backup generator that, like we heard in many of our interviews, sits gathering dust 99% of the time. And a key question arose during this process around how this, what we came to call blue sky value, could help to justify the additional upfront cost to support black sky situations. And during the first workshop, participants prioritized 6 solutions for further exploration, 4 of which were further developed through working groups between the 2 workshops. And we found that having a diverse set of stakeholders in the room was really critical to choosing which solutions met the needs and priorities of the community. And the ones that were of highest interest were the ones that ultimately moved forward. And then in the next steps of the process, having a multi-stakeholder working group to then flesh out the ideas was really critical to developing and refining the solutions in a way that best met the community's needs. And so the 6 solutions listed here, which I won't go into detail on right now, are the ones that were prioritized at the first workshop and spanned a broad range of topics covering many of the cascading effects of a grid outage and really reflecting what was top of mind for the people in the room at the workshop. The second and final workshop, which we hosted in mid-June, a few months back, aimed to provide an update on working group's progress and provide an opportunity for community members to request and offer support to move these projects forward. And so the takeaway highlighted here, that effective resilience planning requires a partnership between various community stakeholders as well as utilities, like you've heard from Denny earlier, was something we found throughout this whole process, but was especially brought home during this final workshop. And it's been really incredible to see throughout the workshops and working group meetings how the different perspectives that each stakeholder brings to the table pushes everyone to think differently and more rigorously about what we're trying to achieve and how we're going about it. And I think this process has really molded solutions that are stronger and better serve more people in the community as a result. And there are definitely certain actions that Holy Cross or another utility can take independently, but this process has allowed them to more fully understand the needs and priorities of the community. And their role as a utility is becoming increasingly less about implementing solutions on their own and more about working with stakeholders to deploy distributed generation resources to meet community needs. And this is really a change we're seeing happening across the country. RMI does a lot of work with utilities and public utility commissions nationwide, and we're finding that this multi-stakeholder engagement model is becoming increasingly important, particularly with increasing penetration of distributed energy resources and as we move toward shared ownership models that enable successful DER projects. So as the CEO of Holy Cross, Brian Hannigan, put it very well at the end of the second workshop, the goal of this project was really just to get this dialogue going because it takes the whole community to build resilience. So throughout RMI's work around the globe, we found that the best and most effective solutions involve multiple perspectives and stakeholder voices. And this collaborative effort really aimed to harness the collective creativity, expertise, and resources of the Roaring Fork Valley to build a more resilient home for its residents and visitors. And it's been really exciting to see some of these projects already moving forward and inspiring work outside the valley as well. And just in general, for me, it's been very rewarding to have the opportunity to engage in a very local initiative and be part of a community of folks who are willing to take time away from their day-to-day work to engage in these meaningful conversations around resilience with their neighbors. And I appreciate everyone who's taken the time to join this webcast today. I think this is an important topic, and as I've talked a little bit about, I think there's really a role for all of us to play in helping to build resilience. So with that, I will turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate your presentation. I'm actually going to go back to your solution slide. I want to take us back there. Could you spend a moment discussing the 6 solution areas that came up, and what were they generally speaking? And then you mentioned that you decided to proceed with 4, or that the community will decide, go forward with 4. Why did some of them get put aside? Are they going to be, phased in the future? What is there a plan for that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to give you the short description of each, and if there's any you want me to go into more detail on, you can let me know. But I'll start with that second question. The solutions that were prioritized was really just based on interest of the community and the stakeholders who participated. So RMI was sort of the facilitator of this process. We weren't pushing them in any one direction, and it was purely based on which solutions garnered the most support and who was interested in further developing them. So we had a whole range of ideas that came up at the first workshop, which was essentially a big brainstorm session. And these are the 6 that people had the most excitement around. And then 4 out of these 6 people then volunteered to actually participate in working groups around. So it's purely this organic process of what people thought was the most important. So the 6 ideas, starting with community microgrids, you've heard a lot about this topic today already, but this working group explored the feasibility of a community microgrid somewhere in the upper Roaring Fork Valley with the potential end vision of a network of microgrids throughout the valley, similar to what Denny mentioned earlier. This mobile generation working group included 2 components. The first was around creating a deployment plan for mobile generators to what we called secondary critical loads without backup, and a second solution around exploring the feasibility of electric school buses as backup power for Aspen School District. Then this topic around bulk supply resilience was essentially a collaboration between Holy Cross Energy and Aspen City Utilities to examine and solve contract impediments that would keep them from being able to share resources in the case of an emergency. The topic around gas pump resilience was looking to understand what backup currently exists at gas stations and explore options for installing backup generation to make sure that people could still pump gas when the power goes down, and especially in the case of an evacuation. The critical services energy assessment was looking at designing a process for assessing the energy use of critical services specifically and proposing energy efficiency measures specific to critical services. And then finally, the community solar topic was looking at how a proposed community solar development in the valley right now could provide additional resilient benefit to the community and possibly be included as part of a microgrid.
Great, thank you. And what was set aside, just quickly? What's waiting?
I can't think of all of them off the top of my head. Oh, of these 6, sorry. The 2 that weren't really brought forward as working groups were the community solar piece and the critical services energy assessment, although the community solar kind of got wrapped in with our microgrids group.
Great, thank you for that. So with that, I am going to move to our audience questions. There are a number of really great ones, some very specific, some very broad. I am going to start with a broad one, and it really has to do with, and anyone can answer this one, but it would seem that sort of energy resilience would need to include sort of radical optimization of energy use to start. So, in California, you've got unbilled financing for improvements to help with that. So just the question is, to what extent does optimization prior to a resilience project have to play a role? Maybe Denny, you could start with this. Like, was that something where the military started with that and then moved to this? How does that factor into
job one is getting as much energy efficiency as you possibly can get. The less energy you need to get the mission done, the more resilient you are, practically by definition. And I think that this applies in communities, in the private sector, as well as in the military. You have to take a look at how your energy is being used. What are the critical mission functions, the critical loads, if you will, non-critical? Are you investing in technologies and, importantly, in educating people in an organization about how to be more energy efficiency without affecting adversely economic activity or quality of life? So it's really, really important to start with energy efficiency across the board. It makes the scope and scale of perhaps deploying distributed energy resources a lot more doable, and it gives you much greater insight into how your energy is best used to accomplish whatever the mission happens to be.
Yeah, echoing what Denny just said. Oh, I was just going to jump in briefly. Echoing what Denny just said, energy efficiency was a huge focus of both this project that we worked on in the Roaring Fork Valley and a lot of our resilience work around the globe and our work more generally. And we really see that as a very, very important first step to any other solutions that you're considering.
Yeah, I would again reiterate that also. Again, we look at taking a holistic approach, and part of that holistic approach is we need to take care of anything that would be compromising energy efficiency, because we want to get the best payback on those electrons as we can and the best performance we can. And part of that is making sure that we've taken care of those pieces of the system that could be energy efficient, like lighting, HVAC systems, building management systems, those types of things, to get the most out of those solutions.
Great, thank you. Another question for everyone. Multiple power sources. How important is that be a part of the resilience game? In other words, you have to have more than one source of generation. Steve, let's start with you.
I'll start, Heather. Yeah, I mean, when you eliminate single-point solutions, if you will, through the deployment of multiple sources of power, I mean, the clearest example of this was given earlier by Steve. If you are reliant on one source of power, i.e. the grid, the traditional grid, okay, that's good. But when you worry about that failing, having that additional source of your distributed energy resource, whether it's solar or some other means of local generation, you are inherently more resilient. If one fails, you can have a backup, if you will.
Yeah, I would again reinforce what Denny says, and also from the standpoint too, quite often you'll hear somebody say, well, the sun doesn't always shine or the wind doesn't always blow, but the fact is it's very rare that the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And we have storage technologies for storing that energy when it is shining for those times when it isn't shining. Or when it is not blowing, we can store the energy from when it is blowing. I mean, it's not a whole lot different than a utility would do now. They have, for instance, in Wisconsin, we have a large coal-fired power plant up in Green Bay. Well, they need to store coal as their energy source. We just prefer to try and do that with a little more friendly environmental energy source than a big pile of coal or a carbon-based source. But again, having that diversity and having that diversity more localized just improves your resilience.
Great, thank you. I have a question that relates to the relationship with utilities. And anyone can grab this one. When working with utilities, how do you get them to hear options that are not aligned with profit maximization? So I suppose it is, how do you get the utilities engaged in the first place? What is it that speaks to them with this whole discussion?
Heather, I'm on the board of directors of the Electric Power Research Institute. Members of EPRI are literally every utility in the country, from rural electric co-ops to large investor-owned utilities. And I can tell you that utilities are clearly interested in the quality of electrical services that they are delivering, and over the past couple of years, delivering that quality electrical services with less carbon impact. It is all about customer engagement, and I think that Emily's example, working with Holy Cross utility is a good one. That's the dynamic that we are seeing increasingly with customers who are key stakeholders working with utilities. My own view going forward is, while a lot of people have frustration with the utilities, and clearly the quality varies across the board, but for the most part, the improvement is there. And we're not going to get to a place where we are going to have safe, affordable, clean, reliable electricity without the utilities playing a role. We can't all go independent and expect to have the same kind of community and national benefits that we will have if we work effectively with utilities and with utility commissioners.
Yeah, I would agree, too. And the other thing we see, too, from utilities is they understand that this technology is more cost-effective quite often for them. I mean, building a new power plant takes a long time, and it's a large investment, and it's a large investment to maintain. You know, a lot of these options are much more cost-effective for them. Also, it can be very difficult when you're a utility if you've got a rural clientele you're providing, and they're at the end of very long transmission lines. Quite often, they look at these solutions as being something they can put more localized rather than running a transmission line into a community, which can, you know, push $250,000 to $300,000 a mile.
Right. This is a location question. It's kind of a twofold one, and I'd love to start with Emily on this one. One is just the space requirements, right? So this is probably part of the discussions that are going on. You know, how, when you've got limited space, how does that affect the conversation? And also, of course, and this is a climate change related topic here that we're discussing, how do you assess and make sure that what you're putting in place isn't going to be impacted by flooding or wildfires, or, you know, in Connecticut, for example, Denny, storm surge or sea level rise? You know, what important conversations do you need to have about location? Emily, what factors are being considered in Colorado?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, here in the Roaring Fork Valley, we have a lot of constraints around location. We're in kind of a narrow valley. We have limited population. There's a lot of mixed land use. We have, you know, a lot of avalanches and mudslides and wildfires and things like that. So I think considering the resilience of your resilient solutions is incredibly important. And I think that's, yeah, definitely something we've been taking into account. And the solutions that we've been looking at are definitely constrained by our physical location, and that's something that came into play, especially when talking about a potential footprint for a microgrid pilot here in the Valley. And there was a lot of discussions around the technical feasibility based on where you're putting it. And then there's a lot of combined challenges with, well, if one area is more technically feasible, but there's no one there, which is something that happens out here with low population density. There's a lot of these trade-offs to be considered. So those are points that have come up very frequently throughout our process, and something that we're still working through and thinking about constantly as we're further analyzing these various options moving forward.
Heather, I would say if you have your substation or your distributed energy resource in a FEMA 100-year floodplain, you might want to consider moving it or protecting it in some way. Location is really important. You have to think about it not just when the sun is shining, the blue sky, as Emily mentioned, but the black sky as well. I also wanted to mention that this is a very, very exciting time to be dealing with energy and, in particular, electricity. Software has been described as a secret sauce of resiliency. I would expand the software to both hardware as well and IT. Artificial intelligence, the ability to deploy and to measure what's happening across your grids, whether it's transmission or distribution or your local load center, is fantastic. It's only going to get better with the deployment of better, faster, smaller, cheaper information technology throughout our electrical systems. It will result in much greater resiliency.
Great. I have one more very specific question for Steve and then a wrap-up for all of you. So the specific question, Steve, is Is there a way of calculating environmental investment benefits, for example, like carbon or nitrogen emission reductions? Is that a part of the concern or the factor when you're putting one of your installations in place?
Yeah, depending on the client, that's definitely consideration. I mean, some clients are chiefly concerned about, energy savings from a cost benefit. But we have a lot of clients that have significant sustainability initiatives, and part of that is being able to come up with a reasonable calculation for what are we saving from a carbon footprint standpoint. What are we saving? How many trees would I be taking down if it wasn't for the energy source I'm going to provide on site? And quite often, a lot of the clients we get involved with either selling or purchasing renewable energy credits too. So again, they're looking for ways, even beyond what they're able to do, to look to get other sources maybe where they can further lower their carbon footprints.
Great, thank you. So we're on the hour. I'm going to ask each one of you for just a couple of closing thoughts. Please keep it succinct or I'll get in trouble. But what advice would you give to a company about where to start their energy resilience journey? Steve, let's start with you. Just tips on where to start thinking about this.
So from the position we take, our recommendation is, as we talked earlier, is let's take a look at what they're using for energy and how that energy is being utilized. Let's make sure that the energy that they currently are utilizing is being taken care of as efficiently as possible. Then it's looking at what is best for that particular site or that particular client. I mean, if they don't have good access to natural gas, wouldn't look at any type of a natural gas generator necessarily, but then again, if they're close to a landfill, maybe we're able to utilize biogas for something like that. How much space for solar is available versus their load. But it all starts with, again, improving their energy envelope to start and properly assessing that.
Emily.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing that came out of our work here is talk to your utility, talk to your neighbors, figure out how you can work together most efficiently to build resilience in a way that benefits everyone. So don't go at it alone.
And Denny?
Everyone is going to have to ask the question, what is our mission and how can that mission be impacted negatively by a disruption of energy? And you'll come up with, oh yeah, that's not a good scenario. Then you go to the solution set and say, what are the options we have to diminish the probability of that energy supply disruption or electricity supply disruption? And also, what can we do to minimize the consequences when the energy supply is disrupted in some way? But it starts with how will our mission be adversely affected due to a loss of power?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, all three of you, Denny McGinn, Steve Van Nieland, and Emily Goldfield, for a tremendously wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. You can download resources, as you can see on your screen, as the slides, as well as a guide on energy resilience. Thank you so much to our webcast producer and technical engineer, Isa Stamos, for making everything flow so seamlessly. This webcast will be archived on greenbiz.com and will be available later today. And as always, for the latest news, tools, and best practices on sustainable business, visit the greenbiz.com website and sign up for our free daily newsletters. You can find out more information there, as well about Verge as well. So on behalf of my colleagues at GreenBiz and our wonderful presenters today, thank you so much for attending today's webcast. I'm Heather Clancy. Until next time, have a great day.